Today I'm going to talk about whether or not the United States should label food products containing GMOs. My stance on the subject is leaning towards labeling, but I am also somewhat understandable of why companies don't want labeling. Therefore, I'm going to speak somewhat neutrally but pushing towards labeling. Before I move on, notice how many countries have implemented GMO labeling in comparison to the United States. Today I'm going to talk about whether or not the United States should label food products containing GMOs. My stance on the subject is leaning towards labeling, although I understand the company's perspective on other things, so I'm somewhat neutral on it, but mostly agree with the labeling side. Before I move on, notice how many countries have implemented GMO labeling in comparison to the United States. I put this picture of the banana and fish because this seems to be people's naive impression of what GMOs are. So what are GMOs? GMOs are genetically modified organisms used to increase their performance and decrease the use of pesticides by making them resistant to insects and diseases by altering their genetic material. Companies such as Monsanto research and produce GM foods and are responsible for the wide expansion and research of GM foods. We can ask questions such as, are they harmful or safe? These questions are what make GMO labeling so controversial and leave so many Americans with strong opinions about labeling. Companies like Annie's and Amy's are pro-labeling GM foods, along with a very large percentage of the population in the United States and 49 other countries. Here the pictures show a synopsis of some of the companies that support and don't support labeling. I am going to talk about Proposition 37, which was lost. I am bringing this up because it seems strange seeing as early in the polls the majority of people wanted labeling. Why did this take such a turn? Interestingly, people in the United States don't agree on much in large numbers, but if you look at the data, more than 90% of people wanted GMO labeling. Companies like Monsanto put $44 million towards the No campaign for labeling, whereas those saying yes put only $7.3 million. This is interesting because the main argument the No campaign used was that labeling would increase food costs to consumers, even though they already have to label and document all their ingredients. So why would they dump $44 million into a campaign and make such a huge deal out of increased labeling costs? Proponents rebutted the No campaign statement of increased labeling by pointing out that those same exact companies using labeling in 49 other countries were doing so without astronomical food prices. So why can't they do that here? As you can see in this picture, Kellogg's Corn Flakes prices are compared in different countries and is actually more expensive in California than in places that mandate labeling. Most consumers buy organic food to avoid GMOs, thinking that non-organic would assume GM presence and organic does not. Companies opposed to labeling often bring up the point that organic companies are trying to get labeling so that more people will purchase organic. This would collapse on itself because as of now, 60 to 70% of foods contain GM, and a lot of crops are still grown as GM free, as both the pictures show. With this percent of food containing GM labeling, it would show that there are non-organic foods that are GM free, so it could be argued that this would help the consumer to select cheaper food that isn't organic. So what food should be labeled? This would definitely include anything where the DNA sequence has been altered. The level of substance is not considered because any genetic modifying would be worrisome to the majority of the public. Clones would be included in labeling, but these would need to have their own label. Important is the public's consolation and any public possible allergens that have not been discovered because of the lack of human trials. The picture in the top right seems like an appropriate way to label versus the picture in the bottom left. GMO labeling can still be available for those who really care without setting off an alarm screaming danger. Companies can label for GMOs just as they would for the possibility of peanuts that could cause allergens with the exception of better record keeping. In conclusion, over 90% of Americans want their food containing GMOs to be labeled. Companies and farmers work hard to please the consumer. Why should they stop now? This picture of rats is extreme, and I don't personally think that GMOs pose any risk whatsoever, but I have added it to show the extreme of people's perspective, and for the sake of public consolation, I think that foods with GMOs should be labeled.